Welcome to Mystery Bible. My name is Ken Primus. I am your host. Last week we took what I call a sidebar, and I showed you guys that from the sidebar that I did a study a long time ago that shows that deliverance belongs to God, salvation and deliverance. Salvation meaning that God is the only one who has the ability to save, and the deliverance is the mechanism by which he is going to save. How he saves us and deliver us. That is his will, his desire. However, he chooses to do that. But what we did see was that he still needed the fate of the individual, and we saw that in the personhood of Moses, when he told him he had chose to deliver them by going through the Red Sea. And we looked at Josephus, the historian. He had mentioned several different options within our reading to show that God had these options. But again, our focus was to show you that those two items, if you will, those two principles belong to God. Those are his. He does it however he wants, and then he will alert us, and with our faith we will then accompany or choose the path that he picked, and we would walk through into our victory and our deliverance, if you will, by faith. And so we showed that. What I wanted to do also, because we're still here at the Exodus, and the Exodus is a very important timepiece on the timetable of mankind. And because I believe it was soon after that, and we're going to look into some of the history of Egypt, I believe that soon after that, and we'll see it is that soon after that, several years after that, the empire of Egypt, if you will, crumbled, and the Egyptians that we know previously were no longer in play, if you will. And so let's today I wanted to just delve into some of the history of Egypt. And there's so much information about Egypt and who started Egypt. And I had a person had mentioned to me that because the thumbnail that I used that had Caucasian people, he was a little upset that about the Caucasian people, and I explained to him it's simply a thumbnail. But what I wanted to do is go into the history of Egypt so that you guys can get some background into there. And so there's a couple of places that you can get it. The history of Egypt is the Turin of Papyrus. The Egyptian, I know the Egyptian historian Manetho, you could have access to his information. The Temple of Seti also is a great source that provided a lot of things. The book of Genesis also is one source about that. The book of Yashar, which we've been looking at, the Seder Alam, the Talmud, the Mishma, the Codex of Josiah. I mean, there's tons of places, guys, that you can get information about. And so the date that we were looking at as far as the Exodus of the Hebrew people is somewhere about, they believe that 2400, I think it's 2448, that they believe from creation. And we know that the flood was a pivotal part in the human history of mankind, and that happened in 1656, I believe it was, if my mind, if I can recollect the numbers. But anyway, those are some of the sources that you can go get information. The Talmud, as I said, the Seder Alam, the Book of Yashar has a lot. The Temple at Seti has some, and of course the Egyptian Manetho, the Egyptian historian as well. You can get all those things. And the Temple of Seti, it was, we know that it was created by the Pharaoh Seti in the 23rd dynasty. But we are going to look at some of the person who created Egypt, and we'll break it down into a couple of sections where they call the Old Kingdom, or way back when, if you will. And if you look at the Bible, in Genesis, it tells you who started Egypt, who was the builder or the creator of it, basically. And that is one of the sons of Ham. And we studied when we looked at it. Mizraim is that individual, and he is this person that founded Egypt, and he was the son of Ham. And this, I think, is being the founder of it is the first. You would consider that the first dynasty, and that is in Genesis. I think Genesis chapter 10, you'll see, in Yashar also chapter 7. Will tell you that Mizraim, he was the founder of Egypt. And then his son Amam succeeded his throne, which is in Jasher chapter 14. And we know that Anon's son, or Cyrus, became the third king of the first dynasty. And we know that Anon, he became deified and worshipped by Egyptian as a god Amon-Ra, and then we know his son Osiris, the god Osiris. So those were the beginnings, if you will, with the Egyptian and what they did within the pantheon of mankind. We know that Abraham was in Egypt as well. We know that, and he was there for a couple of years. We know that I think he landed there in 2023, and then Joseph showed up, and I think it was 700 and something years later when Joseph showed up there. And Joseph was also one of the rulers of the Egyptians. And there's some stories about him, and I'll let you guys know. The first dynasty, it lasted for about 250 something years. The second dynasty was 302 years. And so forth. I think the fourth, we had like 240 and 274 as the fifth, and then the final and so forth. But we're going to touch briefly at some of them so that we can pull out some highlights. And again, this is just to let you guys know that I know, and history proves, that Egypt was the black race, and Ham is one of the sons of Noah. And when you look at the book of Enoch, it tells us that Enoch had a dream where he saw 3 mules, and one of them was a dark mule, and that was the son Ham. And we know that he is a dark, populated, pigmented skinned individual that separated, and that's where the dark pigment of man came about, and we have the black race. And we know that in the first dynasty, means Mizraim, he started that, and I mentioned to you his sons and his grandsons and how they became deified and so forth. And once they became deified, that's when a lot of the things began to shift in the relationship. You know that there's Abraham came there, he was there for about 3 years, and that's in Genesis chapter 12. And when he came here and hang out for a few years while the famine was there. And he met and he knew of Mizraim and Anon and Osiris. He knew these guys because he had met the king of Pharaoh at that time. They were called kings. I think Pharaoh was initiated, and we did a study on this in the book of the Asher, where it's Rikam, I think is Rikayn, something like that's the guy's name. He was from Sinar, and he came to Egypt to seek fortune. And then what he did was he got a bunch of his boys with him, and they kind of took control of the burial places within Egypt, and they had people paying to I think it was 200 pieces of silver for them to bury the people there. And the people came to Pharaoh and complained about it. And then when Pharaoh came and saw him, brought him in, and this guy, he became a ruler of Egypt, and that's when he instituted Pharaoh. And that Pharaoh means Lord of the Dead. So this guy, Rick Ken, Rikayan. He was the one that presented all of these things as far as how he got rich and so forth, and he became a pharaoh and ruled in the stead. So he was the one that instituted for dead to pay taxes and all kinds of stuff, and he became the pharaoh. I believe it was in the second dynasty, ruling from El-Fintine, where he was there. And so we know that Abraham had seen all these guys, and if you guys have been following me, you'll know that Abraham was there, and we had studied this story before when he usurped the graveyards and became the first pharaoh. So that's how the background is. You know that Ham, when he separated and they had divided the place, he settled with his sons, and Cush is the other son that founded Nubia. And you had Nubia and you had Egypt. They were pretty close to each other, again, because these are just brothers hanging out, and they started their own city. And then after they had Nubia, they went and began to spread out. Their sons began to spread out, and all their kids in different parts of the area. And you have all those southern dynasties and all the different things between Nubia, and we'll tell you about that. So as you began to move through history, if you will, it tells us about Joseph when Joseph came into Egypt. And I think you guys are going to be surprised with some of the things that Imhotep and stuff like that, and who Imhotep is. And because a lot of people don't know who he is. And so as I said to you, the dynasty, we have dynasty number 1 lasted 253. Number 2, it was 302 years old. When it lasted, dynasty number 3 was 214. Dynasty 4, 274 years. The dynasty 5 was 108 years. And dynasty 6, 172 years. And so now the children of Israel, they were leaving in like the 5th and the 6th. Pepi II was the pharaoh that persecuted the children of Israel, and the empire of his son is the empire that was destroyed by Moses when Moses and the Israelites left. Because you remember, when they left, God said that they weren't going to leave empty, and so they took much of their wealth. They took cattle, they took everything. And as a result of them pursuing the children of Israel, they lost all the male as well. And the only person there that survived, as we read, was Pharaoh himself. And then when he came back into his kingdom, you have to remember that all these men had died, all of them. Remember, the firstborn of his people were all wiped out. The firstborn male, firstborn women, it didn't matter. All of them were wiped out in the land. And then the rest of the male were destroyed at the Red Sea. And that was the end of the Egyptians as we knew them, as a dynasty where they ruled. The 3rd and the 4th dynasties, that was when Joseph was there. He was Joseph was the pharaoh at the time, and he was his right-hand man. Remember, we had studied that he had given him power to be like a pharaoh outside with the people, but when he was in the throne room, he was then lesser than, if you will, than the pharaoh in charge at the time. Yoshua was that pharaoh of Joseph's time. And we know that, again, if you look at the Egyptian historian, he will tell you some of the things there so you could see for yourself. But yeah, these guys, as I believe, and I've been saying to you guys, that the Egyptians are strictly from Ham's children, and it was Mizraim that founded, he was the father of Egypt, and actually they deified him later as well. And began to worship even Ham, I believe, in one of the notes that I read, they began to worship Ham as well. So as we said, Abraham was there for a couple of years. We know that I showed you guys in the book of Yashar 14, where Rekhaim, he became the first pharaoh. And I talked to you guys about Osiris and how he and his father were deified as well. And in Elephantine, they had a god that they call him the chief god who they worshiped was Kumun, and this particular god, it was a ram-headed god. And Egyptians said that the original creator of the Egyptian god, including Menes or Mizraim, were founded in the first Egyptian dynasty. And that name, Chnum, is within the Hebrew tongue is Cham, it's Ham. And so they deified Ham at some point in time when they began to worship all the false gods and so forth in the Egyptian pantheon. So now, when we look at Egypt in the time of Joseph, okay, in the time of Joseph, this is somewhere around 22, 28. Joseph was, that's when he interpreted Pharaoh's dream for the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. And that was the time, and we talked about it when I spent a lot of time here. This is where Joseph became the viceroy of Egypt at that time. And we know that it was mentioned in Genesis chapter 41 also. And Pharaoh had changed his name. You remember Joseph, I think it was Zephaniah Hanara or something like that. And we know that in the Egyptian historian, he talked about the 7-year famine occurred in the 18th year of the reign of Djoser, Djoser. In the 7th year of the famine, the same one called Joseph, he predicted the 18th year of Joseph, which we talked about as 2235. So it is important now. I'm going to take you guys into a little information that many of you may not know. It says that the viceroy of Djoser, Imhotep, he was the designer of the pyramid at Saqqara. And if you guys that have travelers and so forth, or even readers, you'll know that there's a monument to Sahel. There's an inscription telling Pharaoh consulted the wise Imhotep about the 7 years famine. And we know that it says in other inscriptions around there, it tells us by the steps of the pyramid that the builders refer to Zanakat. And it is pretty close to the name of Joseph, his Egyptian name, which was we read in Genesis. And so Imhotep, he lived, I believe he lived like 100 and something years, 110 years, and that's the same time that Joseph lived. So Joseph in the Egyptian history is known as Imhotep, and he was the one that he consulted all kinds of stuff, and he engineered the feeder canal that the Nile man-made lake. I think it's still there today. That you can go to southwest Cairo. It's there around that time, Beret Kram. But it is called the Sea of Joseph, and Joseph is the one that built that canal that is out there, Barad Yoshefa, which is the Sea of Joseph. And you guys can take a look and see that it's there. And so we know that from looking at all of the information based on the stuff that they found on the pyramid and within the other books and the historian, that Imhotep was Joseph. And that is known, if you will, but a lot of people don't know that. And so I just wanted to mention that to you guys. And he was actually, because it talks about how Imhotep was consulted about the famine, 7-year famine, and the only person that we read where that was consulted about the famine in all the different sources was Joseph by the Pharaoh Djoser. And so when we got to Egypt in the time of the Exodus, Pepi II, Shorty they call him, Neferret, Farrakha, I believe they call him Shorty because he was a midget, actually. And we know that in Yashar chapter, I think it talks about it. We know that the Exodus took place at 2448 out of the Egypt. And so people, these things that I'm talking to you about, they're proven stuff that you could go and find for yourself and see who was at the time all the different pharaohs. I know that Melo was the pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. When, remember, the scripture said there was a pharaoh that did not know Joseph. That pharaoh was Melo, Melol. Melo. So this is real stuff, guys, what we are studying and looking at. I wanted to make sure that you understand. These were real kingdoms. They were real people. We know that it just wasn't like a fantasy story that took place. We know that this is a people that was there. And God judged them because of Pharaoh's attitude, his heart. You have to remember when Moses came to him, and he said to Moses, and Moses told him that his God had sent him, the God of Abraham. And we talked about when God showed up to Moses, how he introduced himself. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that people knew that this was their God from Abraham. And when he went to the Egyptian, he was known as the Hebrew God. When Moses came to him and told him that, he said to him, I don't know your God. And so God had to introduce himself to him. And that's the judgment on all those plagues, or the judgment on all their gods. So we know that there's a statue that shows, there's an Egyptian statue that is out there. And it shows like a dwarf was, I think he was Sineb. They called him a servant of Pepi II in the 6th dynasty. But that in the book of Yashar, it was his second son. And so we know that this guy was one of the rulers of the Egyptian people at the time that they were pulling out. And so I just wanted to give you guys some background as to Egypt, man. It's after all of this took place, remember that Egypt also was the Nile and all those places where you had different cultures and people were coming to do all kinds of business there. And as this people, all the women there, the black women there that had no husbands and so forth, because all of them died. All of the male died. And so from, I believe, the mixing of the Egyptian began at that time seriously, to the point because all the men had gone. And so you have the dilution, if you will, of the dark-skinned Egyptian into what it looked like today. But you can get all of this data, man. All of this is available for you to read so that you can get a chance to see for yourself what it's all about as far as the Egyptian people, the power that they wield, the control that they had, the dynasties that they had, and the destruction of the Egyptians. And that happened, as I said. You have to think about it. When the children of Israel left, they're taking everything. They're taking their labor. They're taking their money. They're taking their wealth. They're taking everything with them after they had them in slavery for several hundred years. And when they left, God made sure that because he judged them based on how they judged the children of Israel, he drowned all of God's kids. When those children were born, Pharaoh was drowned in all of them. Well, that's how Moses was able to escape. They just put him in the basket and sent him down the river. But all the other kids were drowned and so forth. And I've said this to you guys. God said that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. What does that mean? It means that the karma is already, we call it karma. It means that the judgment is already laid out within the decision making that you and I have. And he says, I will judge you according to how you judge others. And so that karma is built in there. Whether if we judge someone and we are kind to people and we live a kind life, that judgment, if you will, that karma is wrapped up in that we will receive kindness. If we're evil and so forth, that karma is built in, so you will receive what you do. So the Bible says, if you want love, give, and it shall be given. Meaning, whatever you give, that's the principle. That's karma. We call it give, and it shall be given to you. How will it be given to you? Pressed down, running over, different levels, different degrees of stuff that you will find yourself in. So we know from the book of Exodus that the Egyptian army was destroyed at this Red Sea. We know that the cattle, the food supply, we know that the firstborn of Israel had gone. We know that the animals were destroyed with the plagues. We know that their labor was left, all of that support that they had to build their infrastructure had left. We know that they took much of the wealth of the people with them. And when you have all of this happening at one time, there is no way that that empire would be able to sustain itself long enough, because there's nothing there to help it sustain and hold it together. And that, guys, is when the fall of Egypt as we knew it back then. The Egypt today is a total shell of what was who they were in the beginning. We know that Menes or Mizraim, who founded Egypt in the first dynasty, we know that he died. He was killed by a hippo, actually. And when you look at all the different information and how all these guys are, it's really fascinating to go and read it, man. There's so much that I couldn't, give you all of that. It would take months, man. But I was just trying to give you guys some highlights basically about it, because most of them are within the Bible, the book of Yashar. We know that a couple other verses, the Temple of Seti, as I said, the Egyptian historian. All the Jewish sources has that information, the Talmud, the Sila Alarm, the Mishnah. I'm telling you guys, go and read. You can have access to all of this, and you'll see the power of Egypt at the time and how they reigned, and the men. And it goes into much detail when you go into those sources about each and every one of the king, who those rulers were, from Mizraim, Anon, his son, Osiris, all those different things. To give you the time and how long they reigned and so forth, and what their accomplishments were. And you can get a chance to see a robust information gathering of who the children, the people of Egypt were, and so forth. But I want to thank you guys for following me and staying with me, because, this is, we're going to keep moving, because the Exodus is here. I wanted to actually read something to you guys when it came to this part of the study before we leave. And that is the content, the information about Josephus, the historian, because he made a final piece that I wanted to read to you guys as to this incident when it comes to the Exodus. And let's see what he says as he begins to close out this aspect of the information that he was reading about this thing that we call the Exodus. But the Hebrews were not able to contain themselves for joy at their wonderful deliverance and destruction of their enemies. Now, indeed, supposing themselves firmly delivered, when those that would have forced them into slavery were destroyed, and when they had found that they had God so evidently for their protector, and now these Hebrews, having escaped the danger they were in after the manner, and besides that, seeing their enemies punished in such a way as is never recorded of any other men, whomever were all the night employed in singing of hymns in the mirror. Moses also composed a song unto God containing his praise and a thanksgiving for his kindness in hexameter verse 32. As for myself, I have delivered every part of this history as I found it in the sacred books. Nor let any one wonder at the strangeness of the narration if a way were discovered to those men of old time, who were free from the wickedness of the modern ages, whether it happened by the will of God or whether it happened on its own accord. While for the sake of those that are accompanied Alexander the king of Macedonia, who yet lived comparatively but a little while ago. And it tells us about that, and he goes on and he tells us, and he says that he delivered it. He says, when it was the will of God to destroy the monarchy of the Persian, and this is confessed to be true by all that have written about the action of Alexander, that as these events, let every one determine as he pleases. And so he's laid out his case. He said he is just writing it as it is, as it happened, and however you want to take it, you take it. On the next day, Moses gathered together the weapons of the Egyptians, which were brought to the camp of the Hebrew by the current of the sea and the force of the wind resting it. As he conjured that this also happened by divine providence, that so they might not be destitute of weapons. So when he had ordered the Hebrews to arm themselves with them, he led them to Mount Sinai in order to offer sacrifice to God and to render obligations for the salvation of the multitude as he was charged to do beforehand. That is the historian Josephus' account. He said he laid it out. He also gave us some additional information that the weapons of the Egyptians were delivered to the children of Israel by God, so that they would have weapons as they began to go. Because remember, there God is taking them to fight to go to this promised land that is theirs to fight. And so he had all the finest of weapons provided for them, and he brought it to them, and they took it. And so I wanted to also remind you guys that Imhotep was Joseph, and because I know a lot of people don't know that, and that is also I told you guys there's a monument at Sahel that gives you that description of how Pharaoh consulted the wise Imhotep about the 7-year famine, and the only person we know that Pharaoh consulted about that famine was that individual that we know in the Bible as Joseph. So that's one other piece that I wanted to make sure that you guys know. And he also reigned in Egypt. He was a ruler there. Moses also was a ruler in Egypt as well. So guys, I want to thank you so much. I hope this was helpful in bringing additional information to you about some of the things in the book of Exodus as we are finishing up as far as leaving and the deliverance and so forth of the people. And then we'll continue cleaning up so that we can move on to the different aspects of this book that we call the Bible. And I want to thank you so much, guys, for your support. And I want to wish all of you guys a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year as well. It is a precious time for us all as we are spending time with family and friends, enjoying each other's company. And I just want to thank you guys for your support, and thank you so much for sharing, liking, and promoting the channel here at Mystery Bible. As I said, the purpose of us studying these things is so that you and I can know who we are in Jesus Christ, so that we can become more effective and change this world